Inside of Westminster Abbey, there are many kings and queens who ruled over England and Britain, buried inside vaults and within tombs. For example, there is Edward I, the warring king who was known as the Hammer of the Scots, and there is also Elizabeth I, the final Tudor monarch, interred directly above her half-sister, Bloody Mary I. But laid to rest amongst the kings and queens is the unknown warrior, an unidentified member of the British Imperial Armed Forces who died on the Western Front during the First World War. The intention of the unknown warrior was to signify the importance of those soldiers who gave their lives for their country during World War I, and how they deserved to be buried amongst the royals, and to signal the hundreds of thousands of dead during the conflict. Today the unknown warrior's tomb is visited by thousands of people who come to Westminster Abbey. But do we know who is inside of the coffin, and what happened with selecting this specific soldier for the interment? Today we look at the story of the unknown warrior. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. During the First World War, around 880,000 British forces died, and this was roughly at the time around 6% of the adult male population. The total number of deaths ranged in their estimates from around 15 to 22 million overall for the First World War, but originally the idea for the tomb of the unknown warrior was devised in 1916 by Reverend David Railton, who was serving in the army on the Western Front as a chaplain. He had witnessed personally the grave of a British soldier, which was marked by a rough wooden cross, and on this someone in pencil had written, "An unknown British soldier." He thought that these men who gave their lives needed some form of national commemoration, and he wrote to the Dean of Westminster proposing that an unidentified British soldier from the battlefields of France should be buried with huge ceremony inside Westminster Abbey amongst the kings, and this would symbolise the thousands of dead during World War I. In fact, they are still finding human remains of soldiers, including from the British Army from World War I, 100 years later. The idea was backed by the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and he claimed that the cenotaph is a token of our mourning as a nation. The grave of the unknown warrior is a token of our mourning as individuals. Plans were then put into place to select a British soldier buried in France who had died during World War I for their burial inside of Westminster Abbey. It was Lord Curzon of Kedleston who arranged the proceedings, and there were remains exhumed from different battlefield sites, and these were taken to St Paul, Sutton-Oise, close to Arras, on the evening of the 8th of November 1920. The remains were received by Reverend George Kendall, Brigadier L.J. Wyatt, and Lieutenant Colonel E.A.S. Gell. They went into the chapel, and the remains were placed into 4 plain coffins, and each of these were covered by Union Jack flags draped over them. The 2 officers did not know where the remains had come from and what the stories of these 4 men were, and Brigadier Wyatt closed his eyes and he placed his hand on one of the coffin of the 4, selecting this to become the coffin of the unknown warrior. The other remains were then taken to a nearby military cemetery for reburial by Reverend Kendall. This is how the unknown warrior was chosen. There was no identification of the remains, and there was no prior criteria for the selected corpse, just that they were a British soldier or an Empire soldier. The coffin containing the selected corpse then, from this, became known as the unknown warrior, and the remains were then left inside the chapel that evening, and it was then taken from St Paul to a medieval castle at Boulogne. It was carried under guard, with soldiers lining the route, and a company of French soldiers stood guard overnight. Then 2 undertakers placed the coffin into a casket made from oak, taken from the trees of Hampton Court Palace, the historic palace of kings such as Henry VIII. The wood was given from the king, and the coffin had iron bands running over it, and on top of the coffin was a 16th century sword chosen by King George V from the royal collection, and an iron shield which had the inscription, "A British warrior who fell in the Great War, 1914 to 1918, for king and country." The casket was then drawn by horses on a French wagon, and it was taken to a harbour where it was then carried on board the ship HMS Verdun. Pipers played as the casket was taken on board the vessel, and the coffin was given an escort of 6 ships. As the vessels approached Dover, it received the 19-gun salute, and it then landed in the port town. It was then carried by railway to London, and it arrived at Victoria Station. The unknown warrior was also given a full state funeral, which was usually reserved for royalty at the time. It was the only time that this took place, with the public mourning an anonymous person. On the 11th of November 1920, the coffin was put onto a gun carriage and it was pulled by 6 horses through the crowd of London. Further gun salutes were fired and the coffin passed by the cenotaph, and it then arrived into Westminster Abbey. The King and the royal family, along with many government ministers, followed behind the coffin and the casket as it was taken into the west nave of Westminster Abbey. There were also around 100 women who were present at the ceremony, these women having lost their husbands during World War I. There was also a guard of 100 Victoria Cross recipients who gave the coffin a guard into the Abbey. The coffin of the unknown warrior was buried in the west end of the nave, close to the entrance of the Abbey, meaning that most people passed it upon their arrival at the Abbey at the time. Still today it is one of the first tombs that is seen upon entry to Westminster Abbey, and it was buried in soil which had been collected from the main battlefields of the conflict, around 100 bags of it. The coffin was then covered with silk cloth, and thousands of mourners filed past the grave. For many who had lost loved ones during the First World War, filing past the coffin and burial site was some form of closure on their mourning. A temporary gravestone was placed on the site, and this read at the time, "A British warrior who fell in the Great War, 1914 to 1918, for king and country. Greater love hath no man than this." A year later, a new black marble stone was unveiled upon the site. The slab is still there today, and it says, "Beneath this stone rests the body of a British warrior, unknown by name or rank, brought from France to lie amongst the most illustrious of the land, and buried here on the day 11th of November 1920, in the presence of His Majesty King George V, his ministers of state, the chiefs of his forces, and a vast concourse of the nation." Thus are commemorated the many multitudes who during the Great War 1914 to 1918 gave the most that man can give, life itself for God, for king and country, for loved ones, home and empire, for the sacred cause of justice and the freedom of the world. They buried him amongst the kings because he had done good towards God and towards his house. The grave of the unknown warrior today remains a close symbol of the fallen during conflicts around the world. When the Queen Mother married the later King George VI, she laid her bouquet of flowers at the tomb as she made her way into Westminster Abbey, as a tribute to her brother who had died at the Battle of Lewes in 1915, and this then began a royal tradition with brides laying their bouquets on the grave still today. Queen Elizabeth II would later lay her mother's wreath the day after her funeral upon the grave of the unknown warrior. The identity of this unknown warrior is not known, and that is the point of the poignant tribute to the fallen of the First World War. It symbolises the huge loss that Britain faced during the conflict, and that ordinary people gave their lives in the fight for king and country. We do know that the body was exhumed from one of 4 battle areas, the Aisne, the Somme, Arras or Ypres, but it is impossible to work out who was buried inside the coffin, and it is also rather inappropriate. Today the grave of the unknown warrior is the most visited war grave in the world, and the mystery and intrigue of the identity is not important. This man, 100 years ago, was one of us, an everyday civilian who during times of war answered the call to fight for a conflict he probably believed he had no business in, being coerced to join by a government who were desperate for people to fight. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.